Good morning, all. It's a pleasure to have you here. I just, on behalf of the Brazilian American Chamber, I would like to thank our sponsor, Latham and Watkins.
Great, and thank you, Paulo, for all your help in organising this event and the support you've given us to this. So today, the event is the ESG Iceberg, how FPIs can navigate evolving regulation and investor pressure in 2023 and beyond. And thank you for everyone who's involved in organising this. I won't list all of the names, but it was like a lot of people were involved and a lot of people helping us. Okay, great. And maybe on the SEC climate rule, what would like to be I can speak a bit to the requirements that are likely to be the heavier lifts, and in that respect, like how should companies that are already producing disclosures, either due to regulatory or voluntary frameworks, react to these?
Sure. So I'll take this in a couple parts. So on the first, just a brief overview of what the SEC climate proposal entails. It's loosely based on the structure of TCFD, then kind of folded into the SEC's existing kind of U.S. securities regulatory framework. So there are requirements for disclosures on what kind of governance does a company have of climate risks. What are the identified risks that are potentially facing the company or are actually facing the company, and how those may then materially impact the company's financial condition, business operations, value chain, a requirement for a discussion of GHG emissions. The required portion of that under the proposal, of course, we're all working from the proposal right now, we're still patiently waiting, let's say, for the SEC's final rule. The proposed version would have mandatory Scope 1 and Scope 2 emission disclosures for all companies. That, for those who aren't familiar, Scope 1 are a company's direct emissions. So, for example, there's a generator that is running where it's actually combusting diesel. The emissions from that generator fall into the Scope 1 bucket. Scope 2 are the emissions from purchased electricity. So, for example, the power plant is burning coal, natural gas, what have you, to produce electricity that you're using. Well, what are the emissions associated with that electricity? It's not as directly in your control as the generator, so it goes into the Scope 2 bucket. Those would be required for all companies. Then there's also a category of Scope 3, which are, for most companies, their largest group of emissions. It's your items that are, for example, the emissions baked into the products in your supply chain, what you're receiving from suppliers, the emissions that people who are using your products are producing. So, for example, keeping kind of with fossil fuels, the actual combustion of oil or natural gas that an upstream oil company might produce would end up falling into that Scope 3 category. Those would only be required to the extent that they are material or there has been a goal established related to Scope 3 emissions.
The watermark from a global perspective around climate change reporting and climate change data, including data that needs to be compiled from third parties, potentially in other jurisdictions, that watermark is rising. And so regardless of what we see in the SEC's final rule, I think from a global perspective, we're seeing investors and capital providers have increased expectations around the degree to which organizations have visibility into their own climate-related emissions, and then also risks associated with it, as well as their supply chain climate-related matters. And I'd love for Debbie to weigh in as well on what she sees kind of on more of the capital side. I think the assurance requirement is obviously one of the heavy lifts, to the extent that companies are required, potentially domestic companies, but there is always the possibility for FPIs to also be required to achieve a particular level of assurance with respect to their greenhouse gas reporting. And what we're hearing on kind of the assurance and audit side is that reasonable assurance, limited assurance alone is a heavy lift. and might involve qualified opinions, but reasonable assurance is a massive lift potentially for companies, particularly once you get beyond scope 1 and you're looking into scope 2. So it's definitely something to be aware of. I think for most companies, we are now recommending at a minimum that companies be tracking their greenhouse gas scope 1 and scope 2 emissions and have those conversations internally with their financial team and their internal auditor around the line items that Austin mentioned, but also around the assurance requirements that may come their way. And again, because this is a global trend, even if a company is privately held or in a jurisdiction where these aren't necessarily the requirements, I think they're working their way into the capital markets in a way where it will become a business to business expectation.
Right. So there are a few things. I mean, again, as Sarah mentioned, we're expecting that some items in the final SEC proposal, the final SEC climate rule will look different than the proposal. But based on the proposal, there are a couple very potentially heavy lifts for FPIs in particular. One of those is that in the proposed rule, there's not actually a carve out for companies that report under IFRS. So that could result in the potential for certain duplicative requirements, particularly given that IFRS is looking at finalizing climate disclosure standards, I believe still later this year. There's not a carve out for those to the extent that those are incorporated into an FPI's home jurisdiction standards. And as such, that could require companies to end up kind of producing two streams of disclosures in order to comply with both the IFRS obligations and then the SEC climate proposal regulations. And this kind of speaks to a point of regulatory fragmentation that we're seeing, where one of the main criticisms that we've heard on, frankly, a lot of ESG regulation that's been coming out of jurisdictions is that it's not necessarily aligned and it's not designed to speak across jurisdictions. This is another thing that shows up, for example, particularly around the concept of materiality. So the SEC climate rule has continued to use the traditional securities law definition of materiality, which is more of a financial materiality standard. But in other jurisdictions, particularly in the EU, we've seen a push towards double materiality, which is not just looking at what do topics like climate, how do they impact the company, but the impacts that the company has on the climate. And when we're using the same word material to mean those two very different concepts, it can lead to a point of significant conflation for disclosures. And therefore, for FPIs that are having to navigate that distinction, it's an item that is going to require really particular demarcation and careful thought to make sure that your disclosures to satisfy any double materiality requirements, for any, for example, EU obligations or any other obligations that might incorporate a double materiality standard, aren't necessarily being directly reported and being understood under an SEC financial materiality consideration.
For corporates in the US or Brazil or otherwise, if they want to attract investors or compete for capital, they have to actually look to the EU standard and make sure that they are doing as much as they can to comply with that, because I think ultimately the EU will set the global standard in some capacity. It doesn't mean that you have to tick every single box of what they're looking for, but I would say even when we're discussing things like scope 3 emissions, while the US may not require them, at the end of the day, I think that's what European investors will want to see over time. And so it doesn't mean that you need to go out and report your scope 3 emissions if not required to do so, but you may want to start trying to measure them. And to start preparing for what will come down the pipeline. I think there is a lot of discussion around, can we somehow harmonize what everyone is doing globally around disclosure and requirements? And while there's a lot of good things that are happening, I think that we're probably pretty far away from that, even with the IFRS standards that will coming out. I think that will probably create a bit more confusion. So the bottom line for me is, if I'm a corporate looking at what I need to do. Obviously, I think I was very informative what you guys all said about the SEC potential requirements coming, and I'll be waiting to hear what they ultimately have to say. But I think that the European regulation standards are the ones that you need to really pay attention to for if you're taking a longer term view on this.
Maybe just another comment on that. We have a lot of major companies have subsidiaries in Europe, and the rules are getting picked up by the European Union. They're very, the size of the company in Europe is pretty small, so be very careful about like having a European subsidiary, because I think a lot of big groups are going to be caught by having a relatively small European subsidiary that's going to bring them into all of the European requirements, which are based on the proposals are like a lot more extensive. Debbie, maybe sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, you touched on before, but especially the supply chain laws, they have serious consequences if you aren't managing your value chain and looking down and seeing where your goods coming from, and can you verify, or I don't know the technical language, maybe Sarah might have a better understanding of that, but I think the general idea is you have to give some sort of assurance around that you are not employing slave labor, that you're looking at human rights. I know at DB, as a German bank, we had to set policies in place where a vendor, I have to go in and say, do they have an ESG rating? If they don't, what can I do to kind of show that they've looked at these issues? Because at the end of the day, well, no one's been fined for this. I think it's something like a potential fine of up to 10% of your turnover. And I can promise you that probably won't be your turnover in Germany. It would be your total turnover, that if you're violating that, then you could be liable for.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to ask Debbie, do you consider that the ESG has become a major factor in company valuations, in terms of like risks, growth, rating, industry, financial information? Can you talk a bit to that?
Sure. So just as I mentioned, I used to be a paper and packaging analyst, and my experience with ESG as an analyst covering that sector is actually what drove me into this position that I'm in right now. And what was that experience? So I saw that the companies in this sector that manage sustainability better, their sustainability considerations better, tended to be the better managed companies from a strategic perspective, from an execution perspective. And then they also were aware of the opportunities that may arise from, the Main Street's environmental, kind of focus that really started to develop. I think if you look back, kind of aligns with the Paris Agreement. And so, for example, a company like Ball Corporation, which makes metal cans, very good at sustainability, they were able to kind of believe that metal was going to take share from plastic over time. And they saw it first and they executed on it. They started building capacity. And so the reason I'm sharing this story is that it's not necessarily from a valuation perspective, just that a company is checking all the boxes, that they're disclosing the right things. It's also related to the idea that they can capitalize on trends related to sustainability. And so especially with more environmentally intensive sectors, I think that's where you see the impact, right, in terms of your valuation. It's going to depend, every sector is going to have a little bit of a different valuation impact. I can tell you the practical approach or the applied approach that most ESG investors, who I would call very serious ESG investors, will take, that have like a long-term view, is they might adjust their cost of capital and their valuation if they feel like a company is managing their ESG risks more effectively. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the company trades at a higher valuation, but what it means is there is a set of investors that are willing to kind of make adjustments to assume that company X is more valuable to company Y. And you have to imagine that that does have some sort of impact. But again, it's going to be kind of sector by sector, of course.
And Debbie, in terms of ESG issues for Brazil, some specific focuses or industries, and considering that we're going to have this emission data, what do you think the focus, the specific areas of focus could be?
Yeah, I think the very big picture, I think emissions, are something that if if you're a corporate, you need to start measuring your emissions. And as I said before, I would encourage you to start looking at scope 3 as well, because I think that's ultimately where the regulation will go. Could it take 5 years? Yes. But you want to be prepared for that. We've seen a few examples this year on the social side around labor unrest, considerations that have had impact on stocks where there's an issue has emerged. And I think understanding that there is a greater lens on how you treat your employees, not that there wasn't before, but when you have, the reason I think it's changed a bit is if you go back to what I said about the ESG fund correlation, ESG fund ownership correlation, when you have a number of funds owning a company that are considered to be, I guess, for lack of a better word, ESG friendly, and they end up revealing some sort of S issue, the stock reaction from a highly owned ESG fund perspective is going to be much greater than a company that doesn't really have a lot of ownership from ESG funds. So you got to kind of be mindful of that. If you are trying to attract investors who focus on ESG, which you should, because I think it's over 50% of AUM, then you also have to be mindful that you have to keep up with it and make sure that you're actually doing what you're saying you're doing. I would also, in Brazil in particular, be focused on where the biodiversity regulation is going. I think that there's going to be more of a focus on that. It's more challenging because coming up with measurable metrics, I think, is going to be a little bit more difficult. It's going to be expensive, would be my assumption as well. But you should be paying attention to the biodiversity regulation and understand that at COP15, which is the biodiversity COP that happened in December of last year, there were significant commitments made by governments around, water, land, things like that, that if we're going to achieve those commitments to protect these areas, it's going to result in more regulation.
That a lot of your records, internal records, may be discoverable in the future. So, that is something that I think is a challenge for companies. Traditionally, the parts of any organization where there was an appreciation for the litigation potential of the matters they were dealing with, there was a heightened level of consideration and caution around creating internal records because of the discoverability factor. I think the same has not been true in the ESG space and the sustainability space. And so one of the things that probably keeps me up at night is the degree to which clients that are really intending to do the right thing are just rapidly creating internal records without consideration to the discoverability of those records in any future litigation. I think Debbie briefly touched on greenwashing claims. We are at the very beginning of what we will see ultimately with respect to greenwashing related litigation. And so understanding that, and I'm sensitive to the fact that this can really seem for companies like they're caught between a rock and a hard place. The calls for increased visibility and transparency, coupled with potential increased liability and litigation. And so into that space really has to flow, what Austin was highlighting, which is creating internal consistency with respect to your approach and your record. And also really having a clear understanding of how fiduciary duties apply in the constructs of ESG and ESG related regulation. I think there will be companies that get this wrong on both sides of the issue. So there will be companies where come to find out there are climate related risks. There are issues around labor and their supply chain that went kind of unforeseen and unmitigated. But there will also be companies that create additional costs and additional structure around ESG and sustainability factors where that isn't necessarily what their investors want, and their investors feel that they're getting distracted from their core strategy. And so really having a clear understanding of not just regulatory expectation, because, as Austin mentioned, I think there is a degree to which regulators in various jurisdictions are kind of using companies as a test case to figure out what climate and sustainability regulation should actually look like, right? And so they're kind of putting the burden on companies to create the taxonomy and controls around what it means to be sustainable, what it means to be green, and then sort of report back from the front, right? And so given that, I think the need for a heightened level of caution around these issues is definitely recommended.
The amount of information that's being required, and then we're talking about companies that are subject to different regulators, and thus they're going to have to explain why their numbers are different, why their information is different. You're talking about hundreds of pages of regulation relating to that, so it's a very demanding times, and I think companies need to be very clear, as you say, in their communication. When you've got this volume of information, if you're not clear in your communications, then you're going to have a lot of issues. I guess as we see the more hard law come in, are there any reasons that companies would still need to keep track of the various third-party standards and frameworks that they use today?
Yes. I have two main reasons for that. The first is companies are not just preparing these disclosures to address requirements from regulators. Kind of as Debbie just took us through, there are a lot of investor considerations around ESG separate and apart from the existing regulatory landscape. Of course, the regulatory landscape can augment or change how that looks, but we've been seeing a push for increased ESG information from investors for a while, and that's, frankly, at least in part of the impetus for additional rulemaking for disclosures from companies is so it can get information to those investors to properly parse through and make use of that information. And frankly, some investors are going to want information that goes beyond what the regulatory regimes require. And to the extent they own shares and can vote them, they're going to continue to push for what they want, and just saying, well, the regulator's only requiring X is only going to have so much weight. I mean, particularly in the first couple of years where, you have new regulations, the talking point of, hey, we have these regulations that we have to comply with, we're focusing on that for now, we'll probably, could purchase some leniency, but it's an area where investors are going to continue to want information, and a lot of times they're looking to these third-party certifiers, standard developers, frameworks to help structure the considerations around these items. The other item that I would flag here is that these frameworks and other forms of soft law often work themselves into hard law. So we've kind of seen this on the climate front with the likes of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, being the underlying architecture for how a lot of regulators are actually going about and looking at the information that they're requiring. So, it's an area where the third-party framework that, investors who, companies that were looking to that ahead of time have a bit of a head start in the race to get information but pulled together to comply with these regulations. And it's something that we've seen, not just moving from third-party standards to disclosures, but also all the way into substantive requirements. And this isn't necessarily reached the climate space as much yet, but on the S side, which I don't want us to lose focus of, because it's an area that is equally important in ESG. We've seen things move from disclosure-related, Modern Slavery Act, you must talk about items that you're doing to prevent modern slavery in your supply chain, to items like the German Supply Chain Diligence Act, the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which are putting into place affirmative obligations. No, you're not just at this point needing to tell us what you're doing, you're needing to actually go out and do something. You're needing to do diligence on your supply chain, and to the extent you're finding issues, you need to remedy them. And this is something that has really been an arc that draws all the way back to third-party frameworks in civil society, such as the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises, the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. So paying attention to these third-party frameworks is important because investors are paying attention to them, and regulators are also paying attention to them for what's coming down the pipe.
That's great. I think we've come to the end of our time here. Many thanks, Debbie and Sarah, and Austin especially, for taking care of the chocolate that's going to be left over here. So many thanks to everyone, and I think with that, we'll wrap it up.